Hey, what's up, everybody? Just a little response to Hardline. I got my guitar with me. I brought a pick downstairs with me, and I can't find it. I got a penny, or I can use my thumb, but I did promise to bring guitar on, so. I just got a notification my own thing is going. But anyway, I'm gonna set the guitar down for a minute, but I do have it here. I just want to respond to Hardline's live chat just now on standards for all-time greats, and also just rant a little bit about the difference between greats of a generation, like you take whoever's active at a time and who are the greatest of that era, and the all-time greats who are generally the greatest of the richest eras, and sort of how, you know, it's a very subjective term and a very broad term, great, and the different ways we measure greatness. Now on the screen here, I've got some of the all-time greats, but guys who are remembered differently. You know, over time, their memory has sort of lasted in different ways. So, you know, start on the top row, you know, Hank Armstrong, Sugar Ray Robinson, you know, they're remembered as, a lot of people consider them, even casual fans consider them among the greatest of all time, especially Sugar Ray. Next to them in the upper right, Maxie Rosenblum, you know, for ratings era, he has just the craziest strength of schedule as far as just rated opponents who managed to pierce the top 10 of a division. You know, by far the most fights. As far as just strictly within the ratings era, his career was just, they had ratings the whole time. There are other athletes back in time who would have had perhaps as many fights under that criteria if there had always been ratings. Bottom left, Tony Canzoneri, very accomplished, incredible schedule, long career, so many fights, the highest level, not remembered perhaps the same as some of the others, but in his day, he was a massive star. He was the man. He was, you know, for the lighter weights, just not remembered the same way. But if you take his resume against some very famous boxers, especially for more recent years, you know, he blows them away. It looks like they're just getting started by the time they're winding down their career compared to some of these guys. Bringing us to bottom center, the great Sam Langford. This guy fought probably 3 generations of badasses in his career, where when he was starting out, he was fighting guys who had been great and started to fade, and also guys who had been great and were still great when he fought them. Like Joe Gans and Barbados Walcott had been great, but he fought them, they were still great. They were just killers. But he also fought guys like Elbows McFadden, who had been elite previously, and then, you know, even early in Langford's career, he's blown guys away if they're not top tier. But he's, you know, but he just kept this crazy trajectory. There's just ever more and more challenging. And then late in his career, when he was losing his eyesight, he just kept fighting, largely at a crazy schedule, oftentimes at a high level or with a size disadvantage. And so when you match his resume against a more modern fighter who would be great within the realm of who's fighting, well, they didn't fight in an era like Langford's where guys were weight jumping, guys were fighting tremendous schedules year to year. And so making a direct comparison, when you look at the resumes next to each other, it's like, how do you approach giving credit for someone being great in their time? But then also keep it in mind, when you say all time, you can't start giving passes out for tiny resumes. Now, hold on, we got someone in the chat here who's with us. Rodolfo, what's up, man? Yeah, I had to come on and do a little response, because I thought BL raised a lot of interesting points, as he always does. Hey, what's up, Uncle Phil? What's happening now? So these guys here, obviously they're outliers, the size of their resumes. You know, bottom right, Harry Greb. Again, you know, as a professional resume almost as large as Langford's known resume, or I should say, you know, on the winning side of things, no one fought at the highest level like Langford that we know of. Like, that was just absurd. But as far as known professional fights, Greb's in there as far as his competition beaten. We can take that from the boxing librarian who sort of is well equipped to judge that, and did sort of suggest, you know, that their opposition beaten score was very close, but the opposition face, Langford just blows everyone away. But Harry Greb did all of that in maybe 10 less years than Langford, like, because he had a compacted career, a long career considering the pace he was fighting at, but compared to Langford, who fought just forever, you know. So Greb did so much in such a small amount of time. As far as concentrated greatness, there's only a few guys who can really keep up with that. You know, if you look up at like Armstrong and Sugar Ray Robinson, they also fought at a tremendous pace at the highest levels for an extended period of time. You know, it's not that no one's ever done it, but it's when you get to, say, a guy who's had 30 or 40 fights, he's had less fights as a professional than guys like this fought at the elite levels. So you have your early career padding, and then guys like nowadays, people have their early career padding. You know, you're brought up fighting beatable opponents, ever increasing difficulty, getting some highlights, making sure you get some wins, get used to being in there, get some rounds in. That used to happen in just a year or two. Now maybe it's 5 or 6 years. For some of these guys, it takes them a long time to fight someone who's a consensus top 10 in a weight class. But in earlier eras, guys will get that out of the way very quickly. Like Sam Langford, bottom center. You know, he started in 1902. He had one pro fight. He won an amateur tournament, won another amateur bout, turned pro, had one fight. But in 1903, he went out there 27 times. At the end of the year, he fought Jack Blackburn, who was an emerging great, and then he fought the great Joe Gans, beat him over 15 rounds. Joe Gans, an absolute masterful, living legend. You know, the old master. He did his whole rise just in his first full season. He just went from 0 to 28, or from one fight to 28 fight veteran, and having fought two of the best of his era at those lower weights. So it's pretty incredible to see now when people want that same credit, where it's like, okay, so maybe the first 5 years of someone's career doesn't even match Langford's first season, because he did all that. He fought ever increasing levels. He fought some difficult guys, Danny Duane. He fought Patsy Sweeney, fought the professor Andy Watson, Blackburn, Joe Gans. I mean, and then plus he fought some tough guys who just weren't the top level, but he still fought just a beastly little compact resume. But he did that all in 1 year. That was just the prelude to the introduction to his career. But let me break off for a second. And Rodolfo says, if ratings existed back then, it would have been even more impossible for people to catch up. A modern fighter would have to fight until their 90s to consistently be active every year. Yeah, unless people start having 30, 40-year careers, it'd be very difficult for anyone to do this, partly because of athletic commissions and sort of like mandatory time off in between fights, but also the structure. I mean, I suppose in theory, a huge star could emerge who is capable of fighting 6 times a year and winning and gets that sort of network exposure. But I mean, that's not really the way negotiations happen. The bigger the star, the tougher the negotiations. So they're coming together at one, you know, somewhere between 1 and 3 fights a year. It's much slower today. That doesn't mean it's easy winning fights. It just means guys are doing less. They're preparing more to do less. Some of these athletes in the past, they were in a rich era. What do we mean by a rich era? Well, if you have lots of elite fighters proving themselves elite by fighting a lot at the highest levels, we could consider that a rich era. And the less fights a year someone has, the less opportunity there is for these athletes, even if they're great at what they do, to prove themselves that way, to have lots of separate people doing really impressive things all at the same time. And then the best of those the cream of the cream. You know, so you go far enough back, some of those contenders, some people who never even got a title shot today, they'd be a alphabet champ. They'd maybe have more opportunity because they were, networks would find them, you know, less racial politics. But you know, it's hard for someone today to match it. So let me just, so like this right here. So when you have Jack Johnson, Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh, and Joe Jeanette all active at the same time in the heavyweight division, is a lot different than other eras when you'd have four great heavyweights at the same time, perhaps. Well, certainly in certain eras. But what kind of schedule are they fighting at? Like, are they having a lot of fights? So how many opportunities are there for them to, one, find bad matchups, but also two, just keep reaffirming their greatness? So you look at Jack Johnson, Langford, McVeigh, and Jeanette, they had a terrific amount of fights. Now, when Johnson won the world title in '08, he started having less fights over time. He got less active because he was doing other stuff, living life. He was making money other ways. But in the lead up to his fight with Tommy Burns, he was fighting a crazy schedule. Langford just had a crazy schedule for over 2 decades. McVeigh and Jeanette also packing them in. So in a given year, especially certain given years, if you look at the activity they had collectively, it just blows away a lot of even great eras where people were doing things that were impressive. Combat sports is impressive, but the total amount of times these guys are going proving it isn't the same. Let's see, Rodolfo. Yeah, that's not today's game. 6 years insanity in today's game. Yeah, maybe a prospect could do that, beating up journeyman or beatable opponents, but at the high levels, yeah, you don't see it. Rodolfo says, I mean, everyone freaked out when Canelo fought 4 times in 11 months. Yeah, and considering the negotiations, that's pretty impressive. But as the A side, he has still been trying to fight. A lot of A sides, you know, they're winning by making a lot of money, staying maybe undefeated or keeping whatever record they have, and just keeping that and capitalizing on that to make money. But he gets paid so much to fight, and he's packing it in. He's really trying to prove himself. So yeah, I applaud any of these athletes who has the opportunity to fight a lot and takes that opportunity, because he's the man. He just keep packing in the money. He could also just just sit back and just chill. So the fact that Canelo isn't, I applaud that. There are lots of fighters who don't make the same money who get keeping it pretty busy, but not on the level of like a Langford. You just don't see that. Like, here's Langford. Okay, as an example, I've been doing sessions, and I've got one tomorrow. I think it's 4 p.m. Eastern time. Tomorrow I'm doing part 3 of my discussion on Sam Langford's fight with the Australian heavyweight champ Bill Lang in England in February of 1911. So I did a chart. So this is the 3 years leading up to 1911, and then what Langford did in 1911. Just to give an example, as far as when you're, what is it to be at the top or near the top, and what is someone doing to prove that they are at the top? And look at that. That's completely insane. Let me get some coffee here while I just soak that in with my tiny brain. Like, if someone fought that schedule today, you know, they would stand out as, like, people would be thinking they were an alien or something to be able to withstand that kind of schedule. That's what Langford was doing. A lot of those fights in there are tough fights. A lot of them are long round fights against guys who are bigger than him. Not everyone, but a lot of the fights in his career, he just was giving up a lot of size. So obviously it might feel unfair to compare everyone to Langford, but if we're talking about all-time greats, well, there were lots of great fighters in Langford's era. He fought a lot of them. There are also a lot of great fighters he didn't get to fight for one reason or another. So it's almost like, you know, pyramid, and it depends how many levels there are in the in the stones that build up to the top of the pyramid. And that being at the top of the pyramid in Langford's day was extremely hard because he wasn't the only guy fighting this many times. There were guys who fought more than that, these 4 years, who had busier years than this, although Langford's were incredibly tough. See, we got some comments coming here. I want to try and be quick with the comments because I appreciate you guys. Xavier, the boxing nerd, welcome. Even Muhammad Ali had 4 to 5 fights in his 2 championship reigns. Yeah, and Ali for one of the, he sort of got a medium career. Like he did a lot. He wasn't sitting around except for the time when he was forced to, which is tragic and embarrassing. Not embarrassing for him, embarrassing for, embarrassing for sort of boxing history. Lost some of his prime. But he did a lot. He wasn't just sitting around like, he was taking on, bad style matchups. He wasn't always fighting at home. He wasn't always trying to be the bigger guy or look for the advantages in various ways. Ali, there's a reason he's so well celebrated, not just because he was brash and entertaining. Lots of guys have been that way. He backed it up. Bruce goes, Bruce, what's up, man? And a shout out to Bruce's wife who subbed the other day. I saw her after the fact in the chat, but I didn't give her the shout. So yeah, thanks for being here. Dolpho, what's up, Bruce? Yeah. Xavier, if that happened today, PD allegations would happen until they died. Yeah, that's another interesting thing. So the steroids era of sports is a little different than the pre-steroids era. Not that people weren't doing things, like there were probably guys doing cocaine or taking some sort of pain-numbing, substance, certainly drinking, different things people would do. So it's not like people weren't taking quote unquote enhancers of some kind, but as far as like being able to, like nowadays, so they have things you can take where, okay, so you take this, and then if you're cutting water weight, you retain your strength. You don't get drained the same way as if someone's just sucking themselves dry to cut water weight. You actually retain more of the strength you would have fully hydrated. Things like that weren't available to people when they had these tougher schedules. And it kind of amplifies. It's not that everyone today is taking something, but you go back to Langford's day. Well, he wasn't taking steroids, okay? He was fighting a ridiculous schedule, and he was inordinately tough in a tough time. But he wasn't like geared up, he was smoking cigars, and I think he had a couple little drinks once in a while, but he wasn't on the rocket fuel. So some of these guys, especially people who've been caught on it, but really just some people today in general, if they want to do a little something, they have that opportunity. He wasn't fighting in that time. Yeah, Bruce, it's great to have you here. Xavier, Dolfo, thanks, fellas. This is a sort of meandering rant. This isn't really like intended to be not a serious video. I just felt like talking. BL had a great live chat. For anyone who sees after the fact, Hardline Boxing Talk, check out his channel. This isn't some sort of adversarial response. I just put it in the title to give credit for sort of not only inspiring me to get into sort of creating boxing content on YouTube and researching Langford, but also just saying some really interesting things in this live chat that made me want to go off a little bit. Especially when we're talking about era to era, because you can be great in your era and not have done as much as contenders in a much tougher era for various reasons, structural reasons, oftentimes nowadays it's structural. People can only, like, let's see an example. So Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh, in their fight in Paris, their second fight of the year, their second fight in 2009, they went for 49 rounds before McVeigh couldn't come out. So today you won't have the opportunity to do that in boxing unless you do some underground stuff. But as far as at the highest levels between stars and like upper elite fighters, they just don't get the opportunity. But that doesn't mean that these guys didn't have that finish fight and they didn't go 49 rounds and go through war. as part of a busy schedule that year, both those guys had a lot of fights. So if you're comparing like some title fight going, oh, look at this great 12 or 15 round fight. Okay, but that's just because they didn't have the opportunity to do something as epic as a 49 round fight doesn't mean that they get a pass on it when you're trying to talk about all-time great compared to great within the context of a generation. You can be great and just have other people be greater still. And I think that distinction is important because the term is so broad. So, and even outside of that, people are like, he did great, or, oh man, I love that guy, he's great. But that doesn't mean that they're saying, under the criteria of resume and proven resume in the pugilistic world, he is great. He is one of the all-time greats. It's just a term that can be, it's so malleable that it's worthwhile sort of mention that. Uncle Phil, what's up, man? Let's see, Xavier says, those types of water weight steroids would be useless to fighters from the same day weigh-ins. Yeah, you know, quite possibly, although if they could keep their strength, even because I think part of that is because of the limited opportunity to rehydrate. When you take those things and you cut a lot of water weight, you're still really strong drained in a state that other people would be very drained. But yeah, that's just one example. There are lots of different things that get manipulated. Water weight steroids are, so I don't know the science behind it, Bruce, but there's a substance that I won't mention the fight as someone in MMA got caught on one of the substances in his fight. And it was, you basically take it and as part of a course of PEDs, but you take it. And so when you're sweating out this weight, and most people that puts them in a really bad place, but you retain more of your muscle strength. So it affects the way dehydration saps the body. So it's a certain kind of, I just call it all rocket fuel. It's a certain kind of rocket fuel where in the weight cutting age, it allows you to maintain more of your, because these guys, they go through these fight camps to get to a peak, but then they have to suck water out usually like the days leading up to the fight. And then they have a day to rehydrate, but they're never as good as they are at the end of camp before the weight cut. Everyone loses something because drastic dehydration is bad for the body. So whatever you get back, you can never be as, which is why sometimes when fighters move up in weight, they surprise people, maybe even surprise themselves. I know it's happened in MMA where they go up in weight, but without the weight cut, they're better. Ryan Bader last night beat one of my favorite fighters, Valentin Moldavsky. They were unifying Bader's heavyweight title because he was down light heavy. And MMA light heavy is like 205 pounds. Heavyweight's up to 265. Clenbuterol. See, I'm not sure if I'm not sure. I don't want to, Bruce. I don't want to front like I know, but I'm not sure what clenbuterol is. But there are diuretics that people take to help them lose water weight, but there are also things that people take that that minimize the effects of however you get down to that weight. So whatever you're doing, you might take something to pee more and or whatever, but then there's a separate thing that people take that I don't think it necessarily enacts the weight cut. I think it just gives you better attributes once you want in a quote unquote drained state. There is a weight limit of 265, but there are very few super heavyweights. There are some guys who cut weight to 265, but a lot of the 265ers are, oh, okay, Bruce. Yeah, I know very little. So you would know better than me, my friend. I just don't want to, I don't want to front. I only know what I know, and especially in that stuff, because I train a little bit, but I've never taken anything. So going back to, and you guys just comment away, or if just anything you want to shout at, anything that's on your mind. This is literally just me ranting. I've got a talk tomorrow, 4 p.m. Eastern time on like a more serious talk. But like people who remember differently for different reasons. And I think when we're examining greatness, we have to you can define terms that don't apply to everybody. That's why you would say, you could say greats of a generation with much more confidence than all-time greats, because then you run into, because there are modern fans where they'll look at their amateur career, like a Olympic champion. For them, that person, even though it's not professional fighting, it's less rounds, headgear, whatnot, different scoring criteria, but they would consider that a big leg up on the professional career. And so they would already be adding that to the legacy as far as professional boxer. They would be combining amateur and professional. So Langford barely had an amateur career. He won a couple fights, won a tournament, won a rematch against the guy he beat in the finals of the tournament. Then he turned pro, at least as far as I've been able to tell. In his memoirs in 24, Langford said he won some tournaments, but I've been able to find one tournament at the Roanoke and then one, I believe, at the Lenox Club, which was run by the man who would become his manager, and like against the same opponent. I think it was a special feature at the Lenox. Put Fitz up there, talking about all-time greats. Xavier says, I started posting old fights to my YouTube channel. I also recently bought a couple of Ezra Child fights on DVD that isn't on YouTube. We'll post them when I get them. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I saw the notification, but I've been working a lot. And then we had a gigantic storm in New England. So I must have shoveled 2 tons of sleet, slush, and snow, and packed snow yesterday just to get the car out to go to work. So it's pretty crazy. But I do look forward to checking those out. Yeah, please, anytime in the chat, anything you're doing. Oh, you guys, if you're doing anything, Bruce, if you're planning any lives or anything, you guys can shout out in the chat. I don't consider that spam if the regulars are, talking about what they're doing. That's just this little sub community. So you say you got Fitz up there, right? And you're trying to figure out, okay, where's his place in the all-time greats? So he checks a lot of boxes, but not all of them. There are other all-timers who have more fights. He had a lot of exhibitions of Fitz. But had more professional fights, or maybe more title fights and this and that. But Fitz being a 3-weight champ, obviously every fight and every championship thing, there's a context to it. But what he was able to do in his day and how prominent he was, it's only because so many generations of great fighters have come since that his name is, has a mythical name, but people may not understand just how dangerous he was and how good he was for his size in his day, in a way that you just wouldn't see today. You wouldn't see that. You wouldn't see a guy that small fighting guys, sometimes that large, with that kind of power. You just, people come around, the greats come around when they do. It's not, fighting isn't a linear thing where everything always gets better, because things are lost over time. Just like in the, we can't just spawn new guys the way we would want to. You got, when coaches pass away, that, they pass some things on to people, but they don't, not everything lasts. So techniques and certain things that work, that's why you see today, not everyone does everything. What fight, if a fighter comes close to being good in every realm, really good in every realm, they're celebrated. But it's like, most fighters are just like they've always been. They're incomplete in some way, and they try to overcome what they don't have using what they do to their advantage. Like these 4 guys, they were all different kinds of fighters. Like many collections of, in a great generation at certain weights, they were all great in their own right. And they all had their own particular dangers. They could all adapt, depending on the circumstances. And they had a schedule. They fought enough different kinds of fighters to prove it at a schedule that's really impressive. Like Jeanette on the right, his main weapon was his recovery and his stamina, but he was a great jabber and a great mover, and could fight on the inside or the outside. I mean, he was a complete fighter, but within that generation, there were other guys who hit harder, like Langford over there, second from left. But that doesn't mean he couldn't hit hard. It's just when you're fighting in a rich era against some really tough people who are, you're going to find some guys just stand out in certain areas, like McVeigh, second from right. He was expert at fighting on the retreat. He could do the different ways to fight depending on the opponent. But when he fought Langford, he would have to fight with, on the retreat, because you don't just go at Langford. People learn to not do that because it just wouldn't go well, because Langford could take it and he could dish out more. And he was really fast at his best. He was really fast as well. So if you just went at him straight away, you'd be another knockout victim. So McVeigh was able to fight these long fights with Langford because he did, as Langford was trying to close the gap, he would retreat and punish him. And certain other fighters were able to do that later in Langford's career, but when he had his full speed, it took a truly great guy to get one over on him, or even draw it out the distance. Generally he smashed everyone who wasn't legitimately great and on fire at that time. And he smashed some other guys who were legitimately great. I mean, Langford was terrifying. But point being, McVeigh fighting 49 rounds against Jeanette as part of a 3-fight series just that year between them, within the wider realm of busy schedules outside of those fights they had, those 3 fights. You don't have an opportunity today to achieve that kind of greatness. Well, that's just too bad. We're measuring greatness. We're not measuring, we're not measuring, well, what if things weren't different okay, so if you go into the all-time great conversations, that's what you have to come up against. And if the person can't withstand that, the athlete, then you can just talk about within their generation. So fighters are having 2 or 3 fights a year today. Well, yeah, we could probably, someone more knowledgeable than myself could come up with the top 10 greatest fighters of the last 10 years or of this generation, however you would measure it. But that doesn't mean when you take it into every generation that they could stand up, or that they deserve to be there because they were great in their day. So let's see, Rodolfo says, that's awesome. Yeah, that's really exciting, Xavier. Xavier says, Bob Fitzsimmons was robbed against Tom Sharkey, knocked him out with a body shot, was DQ'd. Wyatt Earp was the ref in Ditchtown after the fight. Yeah, I think I remember seeing that. Phil Bruce started again. You know what I'm talking about. Get Cheds, who was. So anyway, I've just been ranting aimlessly for 30 minutes. I have a presentation tomorrow on another one on the 1911 fight between Bill Lang and Sam Langford. Part of what I'll do is I'll be going through Bill Lang's career leading up to the fight, because he'd already contended for the world title against Tommy Burns. He fought for the Commonwealth title, I think, or maybe that was coming up. But he fought he'd already fought Jack Johnson, who was the champ at the time they fought. So he was trying to get another fight with Johnson now that Johnson was the world champ, trying to beat Sam Langford to achieve that, because Langford, like I showed on that graphic there, so it happened at the beginning of the 4th block at the bottom. Couple fights, 3 fights in, I think, yeah. With those 3 preceding years, you can see a slew of wins, some draws, and 1 loss to Jim Flynn, who he also destroyed twice within those 4 panels there. So Lang was trying to basically earn a title shot, and his promoter put together a big event in England. And I mean a big event, like a high society event. And there's some notable things about that event, a couple firsts that I'll get into on the chat. And then we'll look at some footage too from the fight while we talk about it. But that's gonna be more prepared. This is just me ranting. So anyone tuning in and watching, appreciate it. And put these guys up. So Langford and McVeigh, it wasn't the only rivalry of Langford's career, but it's one of the key rivalries in heavyweight history. And not just because they were both great in their day. It's because they were both great in their day. They were both really busy, fighting at the highest levels, and they both had a terrific amount of fights between them. So like we could look at it like coming halfway to the modern era, look at Ali Frazier, You know, that was a collection of great fights. But what if they fought 14 or 15 times? What if Ali and Frazier, as part of, 1 to 300 fight careers, fought 14 or 15 times against each other over a span of years? So they fought earlier in their careers, and then as they're fighting everyone else and having all these fights, then they revisit these rivalries. I mean, Langford and McVeigh, they fought multiple times in a few years, but they fought a bunch of times just in 1912 in Australia. And then also Jeanette was in that mix, and other guys too, like battling Jim Johnson. His opposition faced is kind of crazy because he was a huge guy, but he was in a rich era, and he was fighting multiple fights against the greatest fighters of a great era at a crazy schedule. The guys today, battling Jim fought more fights against Hall of Famers than a lot of today's boxers have had fights against anybody. Pro fights, I should say. The amateurs are a little different. Some of the protections and limitations mean you can have more fights, but and back in Langford's day, he had shorter fights, although they didn't always go the distance. He often stopped guys, but he had shorter fights. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, who Langford beat up although he was past his prime, he beat him in later that year in 1911. They fought. He had I think 192 fights in his career, but a lot of those were 6-round fights. So the total rounds that he boxed, even though and he fought a who's who, but a lot of those were shorter ones. So that's different. Fighting someone for 6 rounds, yeah, there are techniques you can employ to get past certain disadvantages or use certain tactics. But do they hold up in a long fight? Langford and McVeigh, they fought more than once for 20 rounds. Now that's a fight. So nowadays, you'd be like the 12th round, here they go. What if they go like 12th round, here we go. This round and 8 more to go. That's a different kind of battle right there. So when you have greats fighting each other for long fights and doing it a lot of times, that's where you start to separate out generational greats from all-time great, in my mind. And these aren't the only guys. I'm always fascinated by the heavyweight division and Langford, obviously. So let me jump over the comments, leave that up here. In fact, I'm going to read the comments in a second, guys. But let me switch out because I've got a few things prepared here for other talks I've got planned coming up. I'm going to try and do a lot of content. Let me just switch it out. I'll keep the same guys. But I love this picture of McVeigh on the left. That's one that communicates how scary. That's one of the more popular pictures of him. But he was actually a very clever fighter and could fight on the retreat. So even though he looks like he's just a destroyer of worlds, and he was a knockout puncher, but he was crafty and nimble and excellently conditioned. A lot of people did not want to fight Sam McVeigh in a long fight, which is another thing and same with Jeanette and Langford, because they were dangerous into the later rounds. So let's leave that up there. Go over the couple comments here, I think. Here we go. Adolfo says, I'm sure Langford taught McVeigh very well in the art of fighting backwards. Yeah, exactly. I mean, McVeigh employed that tactic. He didn't have to do it against every opponent, but he definitely, from what I've read at least, I don't know if there were certain fights because they had a long series. I'm not sure if there were certain fights, but from what I've seen so far, McVeigh would fight Langford on the retreat because he would have to. Because all the different guys who decided to come at Langford, there might be exceptions over the course of such a massive career where you have outliers, but generally going straight at Langford was just suicidal to your hopes for winning the fight, especially at his best. It was a little different when he was older, but people were still scared of his power. That was one of the things he kept, power, and then he had all that experience. Adolfo says Langford fought Jeanette 14 times, if I'm correct. I believe so. I think it was Jeanette 14 and McVeigh 15, but I get the two confused, so I usually generalize, so I'm not saying something incorrect. Now that's a series, and Langford had fight series with other guys. And there were guys he had in fight series that went severely toward Langford's direction, like with Jim Barry and Al Kubiak, guys like that, battling Jim, where they would either break even or some of the time, and then Langford would destroy, or Langford would just straight up destroy. You know, there were guys. So Langford had a lot of fight series. A lot of people got repeat opportunities to figure Langford out, and generally they did not. So Isaac K, what's up, Isaac, says, don't forget the rules at that time allowed you to stalk your opponent when they were knocked down. There was no neutral corner before the 1930s. That's correct to my understanding in the US, although there might have been times in certain jurisdictions where they had a specific way that had to be conducted. I know that the Langford fight against Bill Lang in 1911, I think it was February 21st, 1911 in England, under the British rules or the English rules of the time, they weren't fighting in the clinch and they did have to clean break. And on the knockdowns, Langford had to go over and stand by the ref. He wasn't allowed to just stand over Lang and then as soon as he got up, start wailing on him. So I think it was jurisdictions, because also by 1911, 1912 in Australia, you had a similar setup. And so at the end of the year, Langford he beat Bill Lang, had a fantastic most of the rest of the year, and then went to Australia at the end of 1911, and he had to fight again. He had to fight under rules where it's sort of clean, overly clean fighting, where you don't fight in the clinch. You're not supposed to wrestle. Less than is allowed today, even. So it depends. But in the U.S., yeah, it was a little more freeform, so to speak. Isaac says they were also fighting without regulation gloves. Yeah, I'm not sure how they. I know that, again, to bring up the Langford fight with Lang, that they inspected the gloves. Maybe a little gamesmanship, but if I'm remembering what I read in Clay Moyle's book, I think it might have been Lang's people wanted to inspect Langford's gloves, and then when they got in the ring, Langford did it the other way, maybe as a bit of a dig at him. But I think the seconds, that was the idea of having seconds and have guys in your corner to try and make sure everything was legit. Let's see. Link Rodolfo, Langford knew how to dress. Yeah, he was a snappy dresser, and he was making money. He was a notable person, so he was able to make money. And I saw in the paper, like my Holy Grail lost footage, 20 rounds against Sam McVeigh was filmed, and I see ads in the paper where he was going to do basically a talk. So the crowd comes and they show a couple fights, including that one, and then he would talk over it. And so, there was money to be made for certain fighters. I think when Langford was one of the times he was in England, he couldn't find people to fight, but he did some music hall appearances. And then, not music hall, whatever, theater appearances, and then booked back to the States because no one would fight him. So they can make money. Certain guys, you have to be kind of notable, but in a rich era, there were people who were able to do that. It's not like today, though. Uncle Phil, Sam was a legend. Yeah, and he was revered in his day. I mean, he was mocked also by other parties. But we know what that stuff was about, as far as the fighting fraternity and people who didn't have a weird racial bias, he was celebrated. He was also celebrated by some people who did have a racial bias. He was just so good. Maybe they put it down to his build or some sort of, sideways insult. They try and twist it, but they had to admit the guy could fight. And so I think my main thoughts on just circling back to the original thing that, people could be great. But how much are they doing, and what kind of generation are they nestled within? How much greatness do they have the opportunity to prove? So, so like these four guys, between all of them, I don't even know how many dozens of fights they had. I bet BL would know. Scrapbook might know, like all these four guys, how many fights they had against each other, separate from the whole rest of their careers, which is hundreds of other fights in total. Whereas today, you know, like you could come to other great fighters, say like the more recent Four Kings. You know, how many fights did they all have between them? And they had a great rivalry, you know, and it was a great era. And there were lots of badass fighters who weren't just Hagler, Hearns, Leonard, and Duran, but that you just happen to have those come and the marketing and the momentum and just these great fights. But how many total fights did they all have between them compared to, you know, I put Johnson in here because he was dominant, even though when he was the world, quote unquote, world champ, he stopped fighting these guys. But before then, he had fought them all and fought a bunch of other people too. Johnson has one of those outlier careers where the body of work he did before, quote unquote, world title was pretty epic. So the body afterwards, like with Harry Greb's career leading up to when he won the world title was incredible. You know, and he was past his best when he finally got that opportunity. So certain resumes aren't represented. They're underrepresented in the title category. Like Langford, if you look at the color titles, yeah, he was in there. But as far as like quote unquote world titles, the ones that people call world titles today, you know, he's not in there. He had a title fight against Barbados Walcott in 1904, but that doesn't even begin to describe the enormity of his career. So I think that throws people off today, where they're looking for title accomplishments, something they just some stats they can rattle off. And some of these careers are very complicated. They're not easy to, like these guys here, these six guys here. It's really hard to sum up what they did. Or if you do try to sum up what they did, you miss part of the essential qualities that made them great, because they did so much and they had sections, they have multiple sections of their career that are legitimately great standalone sections. You can't just say, well, they were this, they had this title, they did this. It's too much. It goes too far beyond. And so I do see, like, I found the more I studied boxing history, instead of just watching fights on YouTube and enjoying fights and having my favorites, but when I started studying the history, I realized that my favorites, as I learned about other even greater greats, like even more accomplished greats, like my old list of the all-time greats is radically different now. Because it's like the toothpaste in the tube. Once you know about it, you know, you have to respond to the information you have. So once I knew about Tony Canzoneri, well, I can't put some of these more modern fighters that are my favorites over him now that I know about his career. Or Langford. Langford shot from I didn't know who he was to now I'm convinced he's the man. He's my number one. I have Greb number two, so I never thought I would be exposed to anyone who would take an argument over Ray Robinson, which in previous years, that was because of the way you can rattle off his summation sounds so good, as well as the details. You know, it's not deceptive, but the way you can sum up Ray Robinson's dominance is very easy to digest for the casual ear. Let's see. Isaac K says, on one of the episodes of Mike Tyson's podcast, he talked about how fighters of the 1910s through 40s were his favorite because of their toughness, but he said he beat them all because of how they fought. Yeah, well, at his absolute best, you know, Tyson was so superbly well honed, and also as a student of boxing history, and he'd said him and Cuss used to just sort of daydream about how they'd fight this or that great fighter. And this one, he was still in his mid-teens, you know, but that was part of what they would do, is how you beat Joe Louis, how you do this, while at the same time seeing them as superheroes. They still talked about how you would go about beating them. So I think Tyson would do well against a lot of those when he was at his absolute best. Tyson's issue was once he reached the top, things are going on in his life and career that where we didn't get to, you know, boxing didn't get to see him at his best for very long. He was excellent before he was at his best, even. But when he hit his professional best, you know. So, but it's not about how good he is or which fights he could win. Maybe he could beat most of those guys, especially the first time they fought, because they'd be like, oh my goodness, what do I even do? This guy hits so hard at this speed. But yeah, Tyson gives credit to the early era guys. And he's one of the few boxers I've heard mention Maxie Rosenblum. Saw in an interview where he mentioned Rosenblum, who was someone I didn't know Rosenblum existed until more recent years. But once I realized the level he fought at, and then understood maybe there are reasons there's only certain guys from each generation, their memory lasts in the foreground. But looking at the resume, what a crazy resume. Rosenblum is one of those guys who went from I don't know who he is to I'm convinced he's probably a top 10 all-time great. Same with Langford. You know, because certain guys I would have given a lot of credit to was because I didn't know about these guys who did even more. I didn't know how many people had done so much. I had no idea there were so many fighters who had 100, 200, 100, 150, 200 fights in boxing history. I just think the guys who had tons of fights were very rare. It's like Robinson's career. I was like, whoa, that really stands out. But as far as just fight count, that's one of many. He did so much in that time. Him, Canzoneri, and Armstrong, they had a ton of fights and also did so much within those fights. But there are lots of guys who had that many fights. So that was a shock to me, and that helped me sort of adjust my perception a little bit. See, Rodolfo, that's a fun fact. How many fights they have between them? Yeah, I should do that. Okay, you know what, Rodolfo? I'll do a live stream on that. I'll count them up and and then maybe I'll go year to year and just look at just talking about Johnson, McVeigh, Jeanette, and Langford. Maybe I'll throw Harry Wills in there too, and I'll just talk, because he came in later, but I'll just talk about the fight, just list the fights they had all within them. Isaac Case says all the heavyweights fought straight up. The most they do is a feint and a glove parry. There was very little variation in defense. Yeah, I think Isaac, to some degree, that's true, but also with the smaller gloves and the longer rounds, and at different times, the different kinds of tactics and techniques that were allowed, and the fact that it wasn't all on video. So Dirty Fighter, you really just need to hide it from the ref. Maybe the crowd will boo, but there are different standards. Just like if you have different refs, like a very lenient ref today, and then you have a very strict ref, you're going to see a different fight. So a lot of these heavyweights, they were trying to excel within the realm of what was there for them. With smaller gloves, if you're headhunting, well, you can ruin your hands that way. And there were fighters like Langford who could, especially being short, but one of his techniques was you end up punching him in the top of the head. So guys are like, I'm just going to headhunt. You can, with the smaller gloves, it definitely changes. And I feel that on the heavy bag when I wear, say, some like 10-ounce gloves, and I'm trying to really wail on the heavy bag on a big, like 140-pound heavy bag, compared to when I'm wearing 16-ounce gloves. I got some 18s. You can really go. You can throw as hard as you can. You won't hurt your hands if they're properly wrapped. 10-ounce gloves, I could screw my hands up trying to hit a bag that heavy as hard as I can. So some of it, in early eras, working the body, and also with a longer fight, you invest in the body shots early. So you see them fight a little differently. But if you took just like if you took guys from today back then, they would eventually manage to adjust to the circumstances. Same thing. You take those fighters back then, bring them in today's things. Maybe certain different athletes would thrive under the different rules, but guys would adapt to it. They weren't stuck in their ways. They were just trying to excel within the framework. Rodolfo, yeah, my list dramatically changed too, Random. Yeah, man, a lot of guys who I held in high esteem, who I still do. I just have more of an awareness now. Rodolfo, when I found out about Robinson, I freaked out really. Yeah, Robinson's career is remarkable, and Hardline has some great material on Sugar Ray Robinson. So does Scrapbook Boxing. So if you search for their account name on YouTube as well as the subject matter, you can find all kinds of great stuff. Some of the stat matchups, especially BL has with Robinson, it's just, I remember he did this fantastic rant on the year-to-year records of Ray Robinson compared to Floyd Mayweather Jr. It was pretty hilarious. One second. What am I doing? Why is that up on the screen? Get off of the screen. Put you in a little timeout there. Yeah, so I think, what throws people off. So I put in the title. in the description, like sort of the semantics involved. So we can say people are great. Like Canelo is great of this generation. Maybe if he keeps going like this, he could get into a legitimate all-time great conversation just by the fact if he stays at the highest levels and has a lot more fights. So he may not have the filler that other people did, but he could fight his way into that. He's a remarkable fighter. Pacquiao stood out all time in more recent years. There are guys who can do it, who can get in. Does that mean they're the all-time greats? Well, there have been a lot of generations. Isaac says, I take back what I said. You're definitely right. I had to look up why the early fighters fought with the hands down extended. It was due to most strikes at the time being body blows. Yeah, and Langford said in his he said he would always try to hit him on the point of the chin. I think it was George Byers that taught him that, the former colored middleweight and heavyweight champ who trained Langford, one of his principal trainers, especially in his prime. He was the guy who worked with Langford the most. But hit him right on the point of the chin, so you get like the bang for the buck kind of thing. But the Boston Celtic pose, yeah, that's sort of old. There's something else that I've heard tell of that. So that used to be like a bare knuckle era. You know, that's the fight pose, right? The old timey fight pose. But even after fighters stopped fighting that way, that was still the fashionable way to pose. Just like you think of people taking selfies with fighters today, and everyone puts their fist up. You're just like, yeah, it's more hardcore than a thumbs up, or looks less goofy. So it's almost like that, where people have patterns they were following. But having looked back at the archives and looked at so many old photos of fighters from 100 or more years ago, there were some variations in how they would pose, but generally they didn't pose with like their hands up by their face. They didn't necessarily pose the way that they would intend to hold their hands in close quarters. More symbolic, but yeah, definitely the body work. It was worth the investment in body work. It's like here in this slide I have, so those two photos in the upper left, that's George Byers. So that was Langford's trainer. You can see he's absolutely ripped too. But he fought out of Boston. He was Canadian, fought out of Boston, just like Langford. And he sort of mentored him. There were other guys helping Langford, but Byers really, I think you could say, was his principal mentor. You see, he's got that old-timey pose, and he was at his best in the 1890s. And then in the upper right, Bob Armstrong, same old-timey pose. And then another guy who worked a lot with a lot of high-level fighters at the highest levels, but Armstrong also rolled with Langford for many years. Same pose. And then Bob Fitzsimmons, bottom center, he's in that same pose. But then you see to the right of that, you see Ruby Rob with a different pose. Now he's doing the chest out pose. He's doing the Conor McGregor. Where did Conor McGregor get it from? Bob Fitzsimmons. He just got it from being a prick, an arrogant prick. But Ruby Rob right there with the chest pose, like, hey man, I'm skinny, but I'll get you. And he had apparently he was very thin in the legs, but his upper body was legit. He was a blacksmith. So that's partly why he's in, weighing 150 something pounds, able to knock out big guys and able to fight, and he was that scary. And in the era Fitzsimmons was in, he was technical. It wasn't just that he hit hard or that he just went in wailing. He was technical. He would set people up for body shots or head shots. He had a whole methodology from all his experience, all his exhibitions and everything. So a lot of these guys, they would, like Fitzsimmons doesn't have as long a pro career in number of fights as a lot of guys. But if you go to Cyber Boxing Zone and look at the Fitzsimmons page, a lot of exhibitions in there. And certain guys are like that. They weren't always, so they were doing sort of paid appearances, PR for the sport, basically, showing the science, showing the sweet science. So there were a lot of opportunities for people to pick up technique, even though they weren't reviewing footage in the way that they would today. But these poses from this time, yeah, maybe those guys were fighting like that. But years later, fighters are still posing in the way that they wouldn't fight. Now, some guys like Jack Johnson, he did sometimes fight like that from this pose here because he was, for a number of reasons, he was able to exploit that against people. It was a way of playing with someone's head. And Langford fought with hands down. sometimes. But oftentimes, at least in the footage I have, Langford, depending on opponent, I'm sure it changed, but Langford, when he was fighting Bill Lang, he's keeping his right hand in front of him to bat punches away, catch and counter, or just bat punches away. He does that multiple times in the footage. He's got his right hand up, but he's keeping his left hand low. He's keeping his lead hand low. He's jabbing to the body. He's feinting to the body, but it's also his left hook. He's threatening jabs and left hooks with his lead, and he had the power where people had to be wary of everything he was doing. But then that right hand, so he would go from terror to terror. He's given up 30 pounds against Bill Lang, but he's just bullying him all over the ring, showing him zero respect. And Lang could fight. Lang's next fight after he lost to Langford, he beat an undefeated fighter. So it wasn't like he was totally done. It's just that he ran into an all-time great. But like, so guys had their own approaches. Elbows McFadden, who Langford fought early in his career and destroyed, although he was past prime, he had a way of sort of blocking with the elbows. Like, certain fighters had very refined techniques in certain aspects of the game. And sometimes that would be passed on, but then lost later. So there were things that Jack Blackburn could teach someone that's just not there today from his experience, because Jack Blackburn, unlike any coach I'm aware of today, he fought a billion all-time greats in his day. So he had firsthand knowledge. Like, Jack Blackburn saw firsthand what these all-time greats could do, and he was in there fighting, like he was playing the chess match with them. So when he's going to pass that on to a fighter, you can't just nowadays just become Jack Blackburn, the trainer, and have that lineage of knowledge. Certain things are lost, or they become unfashionable. Tofo says, the Notre Dame fighting Irish pose. Yeah, man. Isaac K. Early fights with bare knuckle, and the early gloves weren't as well designed, so you can still break your knuckles when striking someone's head versus kidney and liver shots. Yeah, exactly, Isaac. That's why the arm is held down low like that. Yeah, Rodolfo Cyberboxing Zone is still active. You just go. I don't know how often they update things, but you can just go there. I'd still search there because they show the exhibitions. Now, I like BoxRec because BoxRec, they have a lot of information on newspaper decisions, so they'll show the win-loss counting newspaper decisions. So like, if you go down on BoxRec, you look at Sam Langford's career, and you want to know what someone's record is when they fought, including the newspaper decisions, that they'll show you that in the list, in the fight-to-fight listing. Even though at the top of the page, they just show the official decisions record. So that can be a bit deceptive. But if you scroll down, so that's important to know, because certain guys, like especially with Langford, where he fought these long series. So the first time he fights, say, Joe Jeanette has closer to an even record because Jeanette's first 23 fights were madness, right? But then in the years following, you see Jeanette wins a ton of fights. So even though at the end of that, Jeanette still has those early losses on his record, but if you look at the years leading up to a certain point, he's won a bunch of fights. So the first time they fight is like this. Next time they meet, Jeanette's won a bunch, hardly lost, and again and again and again. So I like seeing that escalation of careers. But on Cyberboxing Zone, they have excellent information. I recommend that wholeheartedly as a source. And they don't have links for every fighter, but if you go to the old school career, they'll be underlined in blue. Lots of fighters they do have in there, and you can crawl your way back. As most top fighters, they fight guys from the previous generation. So if there's someone, so I do a lot of that. I'll start at Langford, then I'll look at one of his opponents' profile, then I'll start looking at guys I'm not familiar with from their opponents, and so on and so forth. And get lost. I do that a little bit in the newspaper archives, but it takes a lot more effort to do the searches. So on being able to just click to the next thing, like in BoxRec and Cyber, is very, very useful. I definitely recommend both sites. Although BoxRec rankings, I'm not going to say much about it, but it's not really my thing. Not really. I don't feel they properly represent some all-time rankings, but that's okay. As far as a resource, they're a fantastic resource. The only thing I would change, other than maybe the ranks, but the main thing I would change, I'd just get more photos of the early era fighters in there. But they are, they're mostly tracking today, so they did very graciously add pictures of Danny Duane and Professor Andy Watson that I sent them. I sent them some other things. They didn't get an opportunity yet to put them up, but it's not their core business, tracking the old timer stuff. So any small thing, I was very grateful for them doing that. Every little bit counts. Just getting the stuff out. But like I was saying earlier, people are remembered for differently. And when you compare a resume, sometimes there are things that may not be fair or seem fair. Like Stanley Catchell on the left there. Well, he died young, right? So he had a lot of fights by today's standards. Had a great record. But he died in his 20s. So, you know, when you look at all-time greatness, so like as far as like fighting ability and toughness, he's super elite. But if you're comparing resumes as far as the opportunities people had to reaffirm their greatness, he didn't have as many as others because he died young. Whereas Langford on the right there, he fought a long career and had more and more opportunities. So even if Ketchel had a higher level of competition within I'm not sure that he did, but within his first however many fights he had, roughly 50, I think, before he died. Maybe it's comparable to Langford's first 50 fights, or probably better, maybe. But that was just a warm up. Langford's first 50 fights had some great stuff in there, but that didn't represent the bulk of his work. But so Ketchel, you know, you can say both fighters are great, but who has the greater resume? It's not close. And who's a better fighter for their pounds? Well, one of them had more of an opportunity to prove it. So even though it's unfair that, I mean, life's not fair. It's unfair that Ketchel went out young, didn't get to increase the levels of greatness he achieved, but that's life. Let's see. Oh yeah, that's the cool thing about Cyber. They show exhibitions. Yeah, it's very useful, Rodolfo. And I appreciate them for that. You know, there are other sites too that keep records to varying degrees, but I appreciate it all. And as someone who's been a hardcore MMA fan, trying to learn boxing history for just only a few years now, you know, I appreciate all the resources that are there. Cyber, BoxRec, also the FightCity.com. They have so many great articles about great fights, great fighters. And then the Boxing Librarian, Hardline Boxing Talk, and Scrapbook Boxing's Museum of Forgotten Fisticuffs. And there's some other channels on YouTube. Excellent content. I'm just soaking it up. Dolfo says, let's not talk about BoxRec rankings. It shall not be named. Yeah, right? But, you know, I'm over that. The rankings, I'm sure it affects how some casual fans see things. But I try not to get too sucked into that whole thing because I only have so much time and I don't have any feelings left. Like I have admiration for boxing, but I don't have any mixed martial arts. Like last night, I was a crazy rabid fan. Today, now I'm back to a rational person. So yeah, there's a lot of unfairness and things like that. But a lot of these guys, even if they were robbed of opportunity, they still did an awful lot. But they're not all remembered the same way. Like if you're talking about like Barbados Joe Walcott here, part of the reason he's not remembered the same way, even though he was incredibly good and celebrated, the Barbados Wonder at his best. You know, well, there was another famous heavyweight who came, not another heavyweight, but another famous, you know, later famous guy who took Jersey Joe Walcott. So because he fought some greats decades later, Barbados Walcott's not remembered the same way, even though pound for pound, Barbados Walcott was terrifying. So he's not going to be remembered the same way, especially as he fought at multiple weights, but he was the champ at welterweight. Whereas Bob Fitzsimmons was able to win belts, establishment titles at multiple weights. And so he's remembered differently. Both great fighters, by the way. Fitzsimmons is fantastic. But Barbados Walcott for multiple reasons. So he's not going to be remembered outside of people who really have an interest in boxing history. But that's what we're doing here because they were certainly appreciated in their day. Like here's Langford with Joe Louis. I mean, Joe Louis knew what was up. Joe Louis's coach knew what was up. He was an all-time great. Yeah, I feel you. Yeah, man. So I think that's the rant. I guess I didn't really, that was pretty, just a wandering rant right there. But I just got inspired hearing BL talk about, coming up with the criteria for greatness and trying to apply it evenly. I thought it was pretty cool. And it just made me want to talk about it. I'll stick Langford's 4 years back up there. Just 4 years. Yeah, Rodolfo, I love that. I'll pull it back up. Hold on. Where is it? There we go. Yeah, Langford's, well gone, well retired by then, but he was revered, and his coach knew that Langford, apparently Blackburn was trying to get Lewis up to a Sam Langford level of being a fighter, which is a high standard. So, Blackburn knew what the standard was because he had seen so many greats. So when he's trying to get a heavyweight to be as good, and Lewis was a larger guy than Langford, and at his best weighed more than Langford, 20 pounds at least more than Langford did at his best. But Blackburn knew what was up, and he was one of the best. He was in one of the best positions to know. So anyway, I think I'm gonna get off. Hopefully anyone hearing this it was somewhat worthwhile to listen. Either way, it's good for me to vent. I take in so much information. It's good to get some of it out. And tomorrow's chat's gonna be. We got a comment. Just imagine Blackburn as your trainer. Yeah, he was a serious dude too. Like he didn't play around. He was a serious man. You didn't mess with him. And so certainly as a trainer, he wasn't going to be like, "Oh, come on in, make yourself comfortable." He was a serious guy, had a hard life, but he'd also seen the unfairness of the time in his day. And so Lewis was brought up with some of the lessons that Jack Johnson. Oh, thanks, Rodolfo. Appreciate you coming here, man. Even if it's just me and you, a couple others would just chat back and forth. This is great for me. I got to work all night, so this is my joy right here, just talking fights. Especially these eras where they had so many fights. That's one of the things. That's one of the things I'm most interested in. It's not just good fighters, but fighters who did stuff like that. Like that's like those 4 years. So I could spend years studying those 4 years. That's so much work. It would be like studying someone else's entire career if their career started off at the highest level. Langford was already well into the elite levels by this point. By 1908, the top block there, and fought so many rounds, so experienced. So I think it's just, I think it crops it out. I think it crops out part of it's the formatting. Yeah, that doesn't quite have it all, but it crops out the Blackburn. I guess I got to work on the formatting, but that was his 1903 right. That's the part that shows on the screen. There's one more fight at the bottom. I think there's a little bit at the top that's not shown, but he starts the year 1-0, finishes the year 17-1 with 8 draws. If I got it correct, which is crazy. So many things about Langford's career is crazy. That crops off. See, some of these things, unfortunately, they crop off. Let me put up one of my default photos I got ready. There we go. Let's put some greats on the screen. Hammering Hank Armstrong should be on there. That's my perhaps unofficial top 6, but there's 5 of them. How did Blackburn get his facial scar? So apparently he got slashed by his brother Fred Blackburn in an argument. I believe that's what I saw in Clay Moyle's book. He told the police it was just an argument, but he was a hot-headed guy. You know, he was a serious dude, and said to carry a razor with him. You know, he was. But I think that's how he got that one. Unless something, I know, right? Like, unless there was a different one that gave him that one. But because I'd seen written that he was slashed in the neck, but I guess that probably went all the way down to his neck, and they would mention the most serious part of the wound. Yeah, Blackburn was as serious as he looks. He's got a hard face. He was a legitimately hard man. He wasn't playing, and it was in a hard time. But some people respond differently to being in a hard time. I have different temperament. Blackburn wasn't a guy to mess with, but he also helped guide Lewis to not make the quote unquote mistakes of Johnson, as far as like rubbing the racial thing into someone. Yeah, here's a good picture. Bottom right. That's a picture of Blackburn. That's a serious looking guy. But Lewis, you know, his career was sculpted to, like the way Tyson's career was sculpted for him to be terrifying and scary. Lewis's career, just like Harry Wills had been before him, although it didn't work to get him a world title opportunity, but like that, to be relatable and not to seem like some degenerate pugilist and buy into like racial stereotypes as far as how people carried themselves. So Joe Louis, there were a lot of things that came together to get him his opportunity. And he had to, you know, regardless of his private life, he had to maintain a public persona that was wholesome compared to others, including like maybe not celebrating when he won. Don't celebrate, don't rub it in. But part of that was Blackburn, I'm sure other people in that camp, in that sphere of influence, they remember with Johnson, like made so much money rubbing it in people's faces. But there was a backlash from that. So without passing judgment on whether Johnson should have done that, he made the decisions he did, but there are repercussions across the sport from that. So at heavyweight, so, you know, Lewis did get his opportunity, but had he been a different persona, you know, had he been an Ali or something like that, maybe that wouldn't have happened, especially in that time. So let's see, we got some Unrivaled. What's up, man? Hope everything's good. Unrivaled. Rodolfo says, Rival, we were just talking about fighting Irish stance, and Mark came in. Yeah, man, were your ears burning, brother? Someone was talking about the old timey Celtic stance and why it was. And actually, Mark, you know, could weigh in on this. So, not only did they used to punch more to the body, and that was the bare knuckle stance right there, the underhand looking stance, but also that stayed in fashion to stand like that for photos after that was no longer like the primary way of fighting for most guys. But it could be used. It still would today. If you made everyone's gloves small today and changed some of the rules, you would see more of that. Just like in mixed martial arts, when you throw in takedowns and kickboxing aspects and things like that, and elbows and more involved clinch, you know, you see the striking evolve. From what I'd heard, Barbados Walcott had done wrestling and things like that, mixed rules. I think Scrapbook was saying he did some mixed rules things when he was young. So, you know, people cater their style over time to the rule set, but it doesn't take that long. Like in the 90s, early 90s in MMA, they're fighting in the cage, but then in Japan, they fight in the ring. Not every athlete had success going over and trying to fight in the other. And then certain athletes were able to be successful in both. Just like today, you take everyone today and send them back into the old school. Not all the same guys would thrive, but some people would. You take guys from back in the day and bring them into today's like weight classes and slow fight schedule and things like that. Not everyone would be as good as they were in their day. Especially if some of these guys were as good as they were because they were fighting 10 times a year. They were busy. They stayed in shape. So maybe if they were only fighting twice a year, like some people back then only fought twice a year, once in a while. So, or people would have slow years, or not everyone was having a 200 fight career. but there were plenty of people who were. Whereas today, it's a little more measured, to put it mildly. But from my understanding, when they're amateurs, they can fight more often. So I have heard of people who had like big amateur careers, but it's a little different when you take the headgear off and change the scoring criteria and raise the level of competition and lengthen the rounds. So, like a very nimble fighter who maybe didn't have the best endurance today could probably go back to Jack O'Brien's day and do really well in 6-rounders. Haul ass for 6 rounds and get the points win. But maybe not going into a 20-rounder with Sam McVeigh. Maybe if you take a lot of today's heavyweights, especially back, and you go, okay, it's 20 rounds against 220-pound Sam McVeigh, who's capable of fighting 20-round fights against elite fighters. That's a whole different kind of thing. Let's see. Rodolfo says, yeah, I've seen the stances of fighters in the 1700s. Reminds me of that. Yeah, and things, fashions persist, whereas how people stand. But you can see here in this compilation graphic here, bottom left, you see young Peter Jackson. He's got that stance going for that particular fight. He's got his lead hand up. So I'm not sure when that photo was taken, sometime in the early years of the 1900s. I'm assuming, or maybe at the very end of the 1800s. I could be wrong. So it wasn't a rule, but it was also like that was generally how people, you see Ketchel there, second from the right in the top, and he's just got his arms folded like, yeah, I'm the man. So as I'm looking in the archives, in the newspaper or otherwise, or just looking online, you see variations in how people stood. But you also do see, like, here's Langford. And I think that's from maybe around 1904, 1905. I'm not positive. Could be later. You see he's in that stance. That wasn't necessarily how he fought. Even at that time, that would, it would depend on the opponent. But I do like seeing the various stances. It's like Jeanette's got a pretty cool looking stance right there. Different to how he'd sometimes otherwise stand. But maybe these positions, in certain fighting positions, they were also useful. So they didn't have to, it wasn't like it was just for show, but it may not be like they're going to adapt fight to fight. So it may not be the way that they would come in to fight your average opponent. It's all variable. I don't know if this is going to crop this picture of Jeanette. Yeah, so you can see Jeanette here. I think he's just sparring or training with this guy. Look at the size of Joe Jeanette's legs. Those are the legs of a guy who could fight 49 rounds, giving up probably 20 pounds to Sam McVeigh and come out on top. But you see there, he's in that position. You see the other guy's got his right arm up, and then he's got his lead hand there to jab or hook a little bit lower. You see Jeanette's got his lead hand forward, his lower hand by his midsection, probably to guard against lead hooks. There's a function. So even if you see a photo of Jeanette from the other side of him and you say an old-timey stance, well, if you look at how the two are standing in this photo, there's variable approaches, just like today. Although unlike today, the guys who had these crazy schedules, they were less likely to just throw a bunch of punches and then just put their gloves up and let the other guy punch them. We see guys with larger gloves today do that, to let someone punch themselves out on the guard. But in this day, these are training gloves they're wearing. I'm talking about in fight gloves. You don't just let somebody hit you. So a lot of these guys hit and not get hit was how you could survive a schedule. And that's why McVeigh fought on the retreat against Langford, at least in the fights I've seen so far. I've seen the reports of. Because he's not stupid. He's not trying to just take a bunch of punishment from Langford to prove a point or be macho. He's trying to win a fight. And certainly not to just take the full stance, take the full power. Adolfo says, always loved Bob Fitzsimmons' stance pictures. It's personally one of my favorites. The fact he was a 3-division champ. Yeah, and Fitzsimmons, like if you go to BoxRec and you scroll down, it's not every fight, but in a lot of these fights, they have the weight of the fighter and the weight of their opponent at fight time. So even if it's not every fight, you can look throughout someone's career and sometimes see a general, get get a sort of a, even if it's just hazy, get a sense of where they were fighting, what weight they were fighting at. And, Fitzsimmons, man, he was giving up some size. Same with Langford. I wish with those fighters that there were more records of their relative weight, but it wasn't always a thing, especially if guys moving up, they just might not get to it, or it wasn't reported in the press. One or the other. But I would say, to put a heavyweight up there with, say, a Joe Jeanette. Well, Joe Jeanette may not have been the greatest heavyweight of that generation, but that generation had a bunch of greats. Like with Ali and Frazier, you could say those two are the greatest of their generation. Maybe people hold Ali above him, above Frazier. That doesn't mean Frazier wasn't great, that wasn't a great generation. But separate from that, when you start going all time, Joe Frazier with a shorter career by historical standards, you look at his resume at heavyweight compared to, say, a Sam Langford. Well, now that's a little bit different. You can put Ali's, it's shorter, but Ali's heavyweight body of work is fantastic, right up there with anybody's, even for a shorter career. But you take some of the other great fighters in Ali's generation, you start matching them against someone like Langford or Joe Louis, it's a little tougher. So Ali stood out in his generation along with other guys. But then if you're going all time, Ali's probably, of that general era, Ali is the one who most stands up with the Langfords and Joe Lewis's and Harry Wills and all these other great fighters who did a lot. So those are my meandering thoughts on that. I better plug my phone in or it's going to die. There we go. Yeah, and this has become one of my favorite shots. It's actually zoomed in. Langford in front of the stuffy English guys in London. You can see in this one, he's fighting Iron Hague. And so he's got, at least in this still, because who knows what he was in the middle of doing. But I've seen in the Bill Lang footage, you can see he's got his right hand high because he's batting away punches and he's trying to, redirect the hand, stuff shots. But his left hand isn't necessarily up high. That doesn't necessarily help him to keep his left hand high. Maybe it's harder for the opponent to read whether it's a hook or a low or high jab from where he is. And he's also short. But who knows at that time how he would pose. Rodolfo says, you hit 70 subs, brother. Congrats on spreading the word of this lovely sport. Thanks, Rodolfo. Yeah, and appreciate any new subs. I'm glad to do it. Even if it's just me and you, Rodolfo, I'm just really happy to talk about this stuff. But I appreciate everybody. Just about celebrating the greats, because especially someone like Langford, but a lot of these guys, they don't get their credit today. It's not profitable for promotions to highlight how much stiffer the competition levels might have been in earlier eras. They might do it for a few generations back, but they're less likely to take it all the way back. Like, I hope I got my number right here in my head. But so, like, if a boxer today beats his 10th top 10 ranked opponent, or does, it doesn't serve the function of any promotion to be like, yeah, but Rosenblum has over 80 wins against top 10 opponents. So it's bullshit. There's, it doesn't serve any function. But as historical enthusiasts, we can go back and look and be impressed and judge it more even-handedly, give the credit where it's due, separate from what's popular. And so that's how I ended up with Sam Langford and Harry Greb as my number 1 and 2 instead of Ray Robinson, who was my number 1. It was because, Hardline and Scrapbook, along with stuff I was, looking up as a result of them inspiring me, that's what persuaded me, the size of the resume. But I'm going to get off. Good talking. Hope y'all have a great day now. Look for that 4 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. Take care.